And now we turn to gender, which, depending on when you are listening to this, might be a particularly relevant topic. As while I'm recording this, we just had the Obama administration send out their new guidelines for transgender students at public schools, and so it's something that we definitely should look into in a lot more detail. But what we're going to do today, we're going to first talk about what sex and gender are. I'm going to go over some theories, and then talk about gender identity development, and then finally talk about what the scientific similarities and differences between males and females on a variety of psychological traits are. So the first thing is, what does it actually mean to be male or female? So for a second, just pause the video and think to yourself, what do you think it means to be male or female? So it somewhat it depends on your definition of being male or female. If we want to break it down at the biological and chromosomal level, really the 23rd chromosome pair determines sex. If you have two X chromosomes, you're female, or X and a Y, you're male. You can see down here, this is the 23rd chromosome. Two X's female, and an X and a little one, that Y, you are male. But there are other situations where you're not just XX or XY. Now, generally speaking, trisomies, that is triplets of chromosomes other than trisomy 21, 18, and 13, they result in death, generally, except for sex chromosomal trisomies. And this is sometimes referred to as aneuploidies, where there is a different number of chromosomes than the typical 46. And let's get into a couple of them now. So if people are born and have two X's and a Y, so they're XXY, as opposed to just XX or XY, this is Klinefelter syndrome. And that's Klinefelter, Klinefelter's syndrome. This occurs in 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 people. Generally speaking, it results in sterility or at least reduced fertility. And many people actually don't realize they have Klinefelters. They're generally typical in most ways. There's not the kind of intellectual disability that results from many of the other trisomies, like Down syndrome, trisomy 21. If it is noticed, it's usually around puberty, and due to the lowered testosterone levels, they could have less facial hair, weaker bones, and more breast tissue. And there also can be XXXY, XXYY, XXXXY, a variety of combinations. And then there can also be things called mosaicisms, and this is actually true for every chromosome, where instead of having a whole chromosome, you can have part of one. So when I said that the trisomies other than 21, 18, and 13 result in death, that is a true trisomy where there are actually three copies. You can actually have parts of chromosomes missing, and depending on the situation where it is, there's a whole lot of different kinds. Can be at times just completely typical. A lot of people historically, we would have no idea that they had this. Sometimes there are more of them. Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome is the loss of a partial or entire X chromosome. And people with Turner syndrome tend to have more physical differences. This is even though they are, generally speaking, female, they have this lack of an X chromosome, and therefore they often don't have breasts and menstrual periods and are often infertile. But they often have typical intelligence. So it's more surrounding the reproductive system and primary, secondary sexual organs. This occurs in 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 5,000 people. And the last one we're going to cover is called trisomy X, or triple X syndrome. And this is as it sounds, where instead of XX, you're XXX, 3 X chromosomes. This happens in 1 in about every 1,000 people. And there are no distinguishable differences between these women and typical women. This is because of something called Barr bodies, or it's also referred to as lionization, and also X inactivation, where because there are 2 X's, typically one of them gets canceled out. Only the information from one of them is used. And this is true for if you have 3 X's as well. And this is why it doesn't matter if you have 2 or 3 or 4, generally speaking, gonna be kind of the same in terms of the phenotype. And this is true also for Klinefelter and others, where there's always 1 X is left behind that becomes the active one. Now, while in triple X syndrome there's not a whole lot of differences, they tend to be taller and have smaller heads. So what exactly is the point of me talking about all of this chromosomal biology? Well, really it's to point out that we have a hard time defining what it means to be male or female. In the debate about North Carolina's law, it says you need to go to the restroom that it was assigned to you on your birth certificate. However, there are times where there are mistakes, where people are born with ambiguous genitalia, and there are times when if you have an XXY situation, you have 2 X's, but you also have an X and a Y, and so it can be more difficult than just what you're named, or what you are named as on your birth certificate. So, and that's just talking about physical appearance at first. Even at a chromosomal level, it can be more difficult to define or determine what it means to be male or female. That's not something that generally people understand, at least I don't think, that it's not, there's no pure male-female even at a chromosomal level. Generally, yes, in the vast majority of cases, XX, XY, but there are other cases where there are these kind of special situations. And when this occurs, we also need to take into account the sex-gender difference and what there are. So these terms have been, even more than in the past, been mixed up. Generally speaking, though, and at least historically, sex refers to your biological sex or your chromosomal sex. So are you XX or XY? Whereas gender is what you identify with. So let's say you are XX, you're biologically female, but you identify as a male. Well, then sex would be female and gender would be male. Now, I can already hear some people getting upset with me for using this terminology, but this is generally speaking how historically it has been portrayed. And part of the problem with hearing debates about transgender issues is the complete lack of understanding about when one person is talking about sex and one person is talking about gender. They can be talking past each other because they're talking about 2 completely different things. But regardless, whatever it is that we are going to discuss, we have to have common terms. So I would hope that if you are talking to your friends or family about any kinds of gender identification issues, you should at least lay the groundwork and say, okay, when you say sex, what do you mean? When you say gender, what do you mean? Because certainly in discussions we're going to have that discussion. Okay, so let's move on to some theories now. So the first one we're going to talk about briefly is Freud with the Oedipus and Electra complex. And yes, this is ridiculous. There's no science to back it up. But the reason that I bring it up and think it's important to talk about is because I think it helped lay the groundwork for opinions on gender for years and years and years. So, just as a refresher, Freud argued that boys have the Oedipus complex, usually around age 5, where they will want to physically want to be with their mothers. And this occurs when anatomical differences become particularly evident. I mean, truly, if you just look at a little boy and a little girl when they are 3 or 4, it's difficult to tell differences between them at times. So, boys, in his mind, boys have sexual interest in their mothers, view their fathers as rival. Because of this, they want to kill their fathers, but their fathers are more powerful, so the boy develops this castration anxiety. And boys repress their desires for their mother to begin to identify with their fathers. And this is the rub here. This is what I think is important, is that Freud came as a medical doctor, a European, and came to the United States when psychology wasn't really a thing. Again, remember, I've told you that in my mind, Freud isn't even a psychologist. He's a medical doctor and he's a philosopher. But nonetheless, he came over to the United States at a time where this was just, the science was really just kind of getting started, at least in the more modern sense of it. And he came with these opinions that people gave credence to. And it made it such that if a boy did not identify with their father, but instead identified more with their mother and took on the more female gender roles, then that was a sign of some kind of pathological problem. That it was in part, possibly even due to some sexual odd obsession that they might have, etc., etc., etc. And girls the same way. Girls, according to Freud, become sexually attracted to their father and experience penis envy. And in order to resolve this, they identify with their mothers, although they identify with their mothers less than boys identify with their fathers. So, in general, the result is that children take on parents' attitudes and values. But it's also partially, in my mind, why when people look at girls who are acting more boyish, that seems to be less offensive to people's sensibilities than when boys act more girlish. And that fits right in line with what Freud said about gender, right? That boys are supposed to identify with their fathers, girls identify with their mothers, but that identification is not as strong. So therefore, from this logic, if you were to see a girl who was identifying more with their father, it would be less wrong from a Freudian perspective than if you were to see a boy who is acting like their mother. So when we think, again, the reason I'm bringing this up is the history and where things come from, but just think about why and how you might have gained the ideas about what gender is and what boys are supposed to do and what girls are supposed to do. Oftentimes, if I had to be honest with you, my growing up, my notions of what it meant to be a boy or meant to be a girl were because that's how it was, right? There's not as much logic to it. I mean, if you want to talk about breastfeeding, yes, that completely makes sense why girls do what girls do. I guess women at that point do what women do and men do what men do at that point. Because there is a difference. But early on, there's not as much of an actual difference. Instead, a lot of it seems to be society. And so if we can instead trace back and say, well, why do we believe these things? Where did these beliefs come from? And if you, like me, think that some of it could have come from Freud and this ridiculous theory of his, maybe there's a reasonable, it might be more reasonable to say, let's reconsider this. So let's look into a couple more reasonable theories. Evolutionary theories. So in evolutionary theories in gender, the focus is on how gender results from evolutionary selection. And there is an assumption in this that the different behaviors that we see in males and females, at least historically, are adapted for males and adaptive for females individually and as a society. So there are two components to this theory: sexual selection and parental investment. Sexual selection and parental investment. So sexual selection was actually proposed by Darwin, and it has two processes. So there are two parts to the first one that we're going to talk about here. And the first part of sexual selection is that members of one gender compete among themselves to gain a mating advantage with members of the other gender. Say that again. Members of one gender compete among themselves to gain a mating advantage with members of the other gender. Essentially, women are trying to compete with each other to get the best man, and men compete with each other to get the best woman. The more attractive, this is in part, and we'll talk about this when we get to attractiveness, in part, possibly why, the more attractive people tend to end up with more attractive people. Smarter people tend to end up with smarter people. It's just kind of you sort together like this. So that's the first one. There's competition within genders. And then the second part of sexual selection is that members of other genders have preferences for and exercise choice in mating with members of the other group. So again, members of the other gender, opposite gender, have preferences for and exercise choice in mating with members of the first group. So this would mean not only are men competing with men and females competing with females, but men have preferences for certain females and they act on them. Females have preferences for men and they act on them. So if you put these things together, you could say that perhaps in a group of men, there are some of them who are stronger, some of them who are smarter, some of them who seem to be better providers of X, Y, or Z. Well, then women would have preferences ostensibly to be with those men who are stronger, smarter, whatever it is. And they would exercise their choice. They would try to be with that person. And, going back to the first point we made, they would compete with other women to get with those men. All right, so sexual selection. Hopefully we get that with those two parts, and we'll return to it in a second. The second one, as you see on the slide, is parental investment. What this says is that behaviors and other investments of parents with respect to their offspring that increase the offspring of increase an offspring's chance of survival also cost parents something. So, let's say it again. Parental investment is behaviors and other investments of parents with respect to their offspring that increase the offspring's chance of survival, but also cost parents something. So if you are a parent, and trust me, and those of you who are parents, you will know this, when you're a parent, you invest stuff in your kids that take time, energy, money, whatever, away from things that could help you survive and do better. Mothers for, on average, about 9 months are carrying this little, what is basically, when they're in the womb, a parasite. My wife never liked when I called our child a parasite, but nonetheless, for 9 months. They can't do a lot of things. They can't move around and run. Pregnant women back in the day would be much, much more vulnerable to any kind of predator. They can't run, they can't fight as well, they can't do all of those kinds of things. So behaviors are adaptive if they help the individual produce offspring, but the offspring also then have to survive and reproduce if those genes will be passed down. This is why it makes sense to be a parent, because it's not as easy as saying, well, if parents are spending a lot of time on their kids, then they should just give that up. Well, that's not going to survive, because if they don't help with their kids, then their genes aren't going to be passed on. So instead, the genes that are related to taking care of offspring, caring for them, etc., etc., even at some of your own loss, will be more likely to be passed on. So gender comes in here because females generally have a greater parental investment in their offspring than males do. Let's think about this. Women have one egg. Men make millions of sperm every day. Women have 9 months where they are pregnant, which costs the body incredibly. Then the women have more investment during birth, during the birth process. Labor, especially before any kind of pain relief, was incredibly painful. So, therefore, women have greater investment in the child, which is in part why women have greater involvement in childcare. This could be related to other things, like why women are underrepresented in like STEM fields. Take a long time in there. There's actually a decent amount of work out there on that, but it's also somewhat controversial. We don't need to get into now, but if you want to, we can talk about it. Nonetheless, the notion behind all of this is women are going through a hell of a lot in order to get this baby out. And they have to, when a man can go have sex with a woman, one-time deal, and then leave and never be seen from again. Women, if they get pregnant, can't do that. And evolutionarily, if that happens with a man, then he leaves. It's not as good for the child, but the child could still survive. Whereas if the woman just says, no, I'm sorry, I'm not taking care of this baby, that baby is going to die, and they are less likely to pass on their genes in that way. Now, there's mixed evidence for this. There's support through biology as well. There are some signs, females who are exposed to higher levels of androgens prenatally, those are like testosterone, more kind of male hormones. They are more likely to display male stereotyped behaviors. There are also biological differences in the brain between men and women. So it does seem that if you were to tell me that gender is a 100% socially constructed phenomenon and there would be no gender differences or sex differences between males and females if it weren't for sexism, I'm just not going to buy that because of these arguments. To say that they are increased because of it, that is surely, yes, there's no doubt there. Now, there's also some newer work that says that it is evolutionarily advantageous for us to have males and females at a group level because it allows for any group of people to not have everyone be able to be pregnant, and allows for a better distribution of labor. Meaning that just like how there are different kinds of ants, there are different kinds of humans, and it just so happens that females are the ones who are more responsible for child rearing and giving birth and getting pregnant and all of this, and men would be the ones who are more for warfare and the like. Now this again also is controversial, has mixed evidence, but nonetheless there are many things out there that would say that there are reasons beyond strictly sexism, prejudice, and discrimination that we would have this male-female difference pop up. Culture. So let's get to some cultural theories here. Sociocultural theory also says that division of labor is big, but they say that division of labor drives all other psychological gender differences. That gender differences result from an individual's adaptations to restrictions and opportunities for their gender in society. So the theory acknowledges biological differences and says that these differences contribute to the division of labor by gender, where men are larger, stronger, etc., better for warfare and the like. And once these differences are in place, behavior became more dominant in males and females became more subordinate over time at this group level. And other qualities from this division, such as nurturance and an emphasis on relationships in females, came about because of this. So while evolutionary theorists look to cross-cultural universals, sociocultural theories focus on variations across cultures. And one study looked at differences in gender power and status and gender differences in mate preference, and found that the larger the differences in mate preferences, the larger inequality in a society. This would not be something that evolutionary theorists would look at quite as much. Social learning theories. So, as you can probably guess, social learning theories, less biologically predetermined, they don't care as much about that. Their emphasis more is on behavior being shaped by reinforcement and punishment, and that we learn by imitation and models. So, children watch the behavior of parents, teachers, siblings, peers, etc. And so, let's just talk about football. You have a football game on. What would a child take is something they could do from watching a football game? Well, boys would say, I can be a football player. Girls would say, I can be a cheerleader. Simply by the models that they are watching on TV. It doesn't have anything to do at this level. Social learning theory is not really concerned with whether or not physiologically a woman could play football, or for that matter, if many of the boys watching could play football. But just that you see people who you can identify with, and you say, I could be like them. Now, this is particularly strong in the media, of course. TV and video games are big and also have big gender roles here. So males dominate media all around. And media also tend to represent traditional gender roles. The media are less likely to show women as productive, working, as decision makers. And cognitive theorists have been added into here as well, and they look at things like attention, self-regulation, self-efficacy, and look at perception of math abilities. So in the past, and I've seen some recent studies that contradict this, but let's just go with it. In the past, boys and girls do generally the same in math performance. But math self-efficacy is much lower in women. So their own notion as to whether or not they can actually be successful. So cognitive theorists also say that preschoolers have a desire to have a clear-cut sense of gender identity. And that they develop a gender schema. And a schema like literally as what Piaget thought of. And these schemas are developed early in life and serve as a lens through which children view the world. Cognitive developmental theories would say that the rigidity in stereotypes reflect a failure of children to understand sex differences. So preschoolers think that it's not that sex is not based on biology, but instead in differences in appearance and behavior. Now, by age 4 or 5, they develop gender consistency, which is just the awareness that people are permanently males or females, depending on biology, although that is, up for debate. Let's get to the last kind of theory here, and that is the gender similarities hypothesis. What this says is that males and females are similar in most, but not all, psychological variables. We're going to get some evidence to this later, but evidence for this comes from meta-analyses. And meta-analyses, it's a technical thing, but it takes results from multiple studies and it aggregates the results and says what general effect sizes are. So it takes a bunch of studies, because you can always get the one study out of 20 that shows something weird, and people can hammer that home, even though it might not be representative. There might be 19 of 20 studies that contradict it. So a meta-analysis tries to take into account that and kind of pool the results of all these studies. So in looking at 46 meta-analyses on gender differences, they found 124 effect sizes. And what they found was that 78% of gender differences were small or close to zero. 78%. That's huge. So evolutionary theories focus on sexual selection, but selection should act on men and women equally. And additionally, chromosomally, most humans have 23 pairs, and only one is the difference between males and females. The other 22 are in both, and they pass from fathers pass information to daughters, mothers to sons, etc. Other theories can explain similarities as well as differences, but the fact of the matter is, we are all so much more alike than different. And so it would make sense, theoretically, and is borne out in the evidence, that men and women are not, in fact, that different. We will talk about some more of them, some more of the real differences later. And then we can also have more discussions about whether or not the differences show up because of biological differences or whether or not there's some kind of parenting. So punishing people for gender violating behaviors. Is that why there are gender differences, or is it because there's a real actual difference between men and women? So how do people come up with a gender identity, or what's the timeline at least? Well, you can see on the slide, by 3 to 4 months, they can distinguish between male and female faces, and this is based on habituation, which we talked about earlier in the semester, and preferential learning as well. 6 months, they can discriminate faces and voices by sex. 10 months, they have these stereotypical associations between male and females and gender-typed objects, which is very interesting. And this suggests that kids, by even 10 months, can come up with primitive stereotypes that actually conform to adult stereotypes. Now, these might not have the same the conceptual meanings as adults. There's probably not the same thought process behind it for them that we would have, but nonetheless. And by 24 to 29 months, they can label groups and use gender labels in speech fairly easily. So if you take all of this together, it would indicate that there is an ability to label gender groups and by about 18 to 24 months or so. And this actually fits with the notion, this developmental timeline, that around age 2 is when gender-typed play starts more. And also more with the notion that around 18 months or so we start to form a sense of self. Now, let's talk about actual stereotypes and prejudice, not just differences in how long they gaze at one another or habituation, but when do these things really come to be cognitive? The stereotypes come in around age 2, and many have them by around age 3. So begin at 2, in place more by 3. And at first, they show an understanding of sex differences associated with adult things, adult possessions, physical appearance, roles, etc. By around 4.5, children tend to believe that girls have more relational aggression than boys, and this continues through 4th to 5th grade, where girls are generally seen as nicer, wearing dresses, liking dolls, etc. Stereotypes about sports and occupation become more sophisticated in early childhood as they go on. And gender stereotypes are actually the strongest around age 5 or 6. For them, that's just the way it is. The movie Little Miss Sunshine has a moment that puts this kind of perfectly. At one point in time, the little girl Abigail Breslin asks Steve Carell's character why something happened, and he says that he fell in love with a boy, and she says, "You fell in love with a boy? That's silly." Because to her, at her age, that's just not something that happens, right? The stereotype is set: boys like girls, girls like boys. There's no crossover. That's just not a thing that occurs. Again, that is just in the child's mind. Um, Nonetheless. So, in prejudice, in preschool, some children report feeling more positively about their own sex. And studies actually differ on age trends, depend also on measures that are used. Um, but when children exhibit gender norm violations, generally kindergartners will do one of three things. They will either correct them, they will ridicule them, or they will use identity negation. So let's walk through what the three of these are. So let's say a boy starts doing more girl-like things. Let's say this boy's name is Jeff. So Jeff starts playing with a girl puppet. Well, the kindergartner might come over to Jeff, take the girl puppet, and give it to a girl, correcting this supposed wrong. They could also ridicule, that's the second one. They say something nasty and the like. Or they could use identity negation, where they say, kind of cognitively, Jeff is a girl. Now, some studies show that children can identify who in the class is actually most likely to enforce gender rules. When asked, in particular, who in your class, quote, who in your class says you shouldn't play because you are a boy or girl, end quote. And those who had a greater exposure to a gender enforcer peer were actually more likely to limit their play to same-sex peers, which indicates that there might be the beginning of sexism of a sort early on, and that the gender police might actually help maintain gender roles early. And how does gender typing stability stay? How does that work? Well, there are actually few longitudinal studies of gender typing, largely because people don't pay attention to things that are stable. It just identifies you as what you are. This type of thing, basically, and I should actually just say what it is at a more basic level. The notion that someone could be transgender is something that was not a theory, a component of many theories of gender development. It was not. It wasn't a thing. Most of the time, it was looked at as pathological. It was not looked at as something to even really talk about because it wasn't supposed to happen. If you properly, according to Freud, if you properly went through the stages, you would not have this occur. So the theories would emphasize factors that lead to gender typing. So studies would use gender typing as an outcome, but not the stability. Other people have said that longitudinal analyses in childhood actually aren't even credible because what gender means and what gender identity is in childhood is so much different. Now, one of the assignments, one of the things I'm going to have you read is actually about a transgender 4-year-old and whether or not they have the cognitive capacity to make this decision or to make this declaration or whatever you think that might be. And some people might say it's not that big a deal, but to many people it is. It can be a huge source of stress for the child and family. But also, as we will see in puberty, puberty is starting earlier and earlier. Girls, on average, the normal range, the beginning of puberty, starts around 8. So if you want to stop a biological girl from becoming a woman and going through puberty, you would have to stop that early on. This is, of course, going to be a huge level of controversy that we haven't even begun to get into as a society yet. So, a little bit more about gender socialization. So, we've talked about the biological components a bit, at least how it relates more to psychology. But how do we become socialized? What are the socialized components? Well, girls and boys are treated differently from birth. And while um, gender starts to really emerge in the preschool years, the early on, around age 2, we already said they can identify themselves as boys or girls, and also they are exposed to preferences in dress and toys, and et cetera, from an early age. So boys tend to spend more time in rough and tumble play. Girls tend to spend more time in organized activities and games and role playing. In preschool, boys tend to play with boys and girls tend to play with girls a disproportionate amount. But girls actually prefer same-sex playmates earlier than boys. That starts around 2, whereas boys don't really care until around age 3. It seems like the girls might know that the boys are rough before the boys notice that the girls are not as fun or something. I don't know. And because of the strict nature of their stereotypes, this set in pretty early on. And you might think that these stereotypes we shouldn't really pay much attention to them. The gender appropriate behavior stereotypes are actually um, almost in every case exactly what the adult version would be, but they are less flexible. That's the difference. So we get socialized in many ways, the way parents talk to each other, even names that you give children can lead expectations to what type of person they're going to be and who they're going to become, how they are dressed from an early age. We were shocked down here. I'm not from the South. And so the fact that my daughter didn't have huge pink bows in her hair, actually either of them, from birth seemed to be maybe not a problem, but it was a thing. Many people would kind of ask if she was a little boy. It's like, well, she has a purple shirt on, but I guess because she doesn't have bows, that's not enough. It's weird how all this works, but nonetheless, the stereotypes early, or I'm sorry, socialization and stereotypes early on. So let's get to similarities and differences. And when we're going through this, we're going to talk about what historically has been there, as well as what is there now, at least as far as the data support. So let's talk about cognitive abilities. In 1990, there were minor differences um, in cognitive levels across the um, cross cognitive domains for men and women, largely in men performing better, but especially in high level problem solving. Now, in 2005, these data were re examined and basically found that these differences were gone. And across studies, they found that effect sizes typically are very small, as in the negative zero point zero 0.02 to positive zero point zero 0.06. Now, I should clarify quickly what this means. Generally, 0.15, zero point 0.2 is going to be somewhat small in terms of an effect size. So these aren't even small effect sizes. Effect sizes go fairly high, but if you get an effect size of zero point 0.6 or something, you're talking about a relatively large effect. So 0.6 would be high. We're talking about 0.06, so very small. In 2007, there was another one that looked at 1.1 million people and found no difference, with the only small difference in complex problem solving, a difference of 0.16, where men were better than women. 2010, there was another one, but this time it was international, not just in the US. But what it found that was interesting is there was huge variability across nations, where the magnitude and the direction of the difference direction of the effect would be different from place to place. So what this shows is that males and females are basically the same in cognitive areas in the United States, but around the world there are huge differences, and the directions of the differences depend. and that's primarily in math also. In verbal areas, there's a stereotype that females are better verbal scorers than males, but the difference is quite small. It's zero point 0.1. There are some differences in subtypes of verbal ability, though. In vocabulary, reading comprehension, essay writing, there are either no or small effects. The biggest effect was in verbal fluency, which is one very small subscale, was a zero point 0.3 difference. So it's not, again, generally speaking, not any big differences here. Internationally, it's actually been seen, and this includes also in the United States, it's been seen that boys actually outnumber girls 4.5 to 1 at the lowest levels in verbal ability. And this might be why there is a stereotype that girls are better than boys. It might not be that girls are actually on average that much better, but just there are so many more boys who are really, really bad. And these questions come up because does this mean that there's a learning disability or something going on? And there's some interesting work out there that shows that perhaps there's something about variability and intelligence in males versus females, that it's bigger in males, which would also be possibly be the reason why there are more genius level IQs in males than females. So that would mean that there are more males at the high end and the low end, disproportionate to women. But there are no answers here. There are more questions that are asked that always come up from these studies. Attitudes. This is attitudes about cognitive ability. These are important generally because they predict educational and career outcomes. And what is found here is that gender differences in self-confidence are bigger than the difference in actual performance, meaning that anytime there is a difference that is found, there is a perception of a larger difference than there actually is. So people are wrong in the long and the short of it, but it's one area for to help specifically girls out. In terms of personality, temperament. So temperament is biologically based, and the technical definition, biologically based emotional and behavioral consistencies that appear early in life. That's biologically based emotional and behavioral consistencies that appear early in life. These temperament variables can predict outcomes in domains like psychopathology and personality. It's actually, many people think of it as the earliest indication of what later personality is going to be. But this is in kids too young to actually show personality. So girls are better at inhibitory control and attention with small to moderate effects in the 0.2 to 0.4 range. They can stop doing what they're not supposed to be doing, and they can pay attention to things better than boys. But the large differences generally are in the bottom half of the range because boys have between 2 and 9 times as much ADHD as girls. So they have a ton more ADHD, so it makes sense that on the low end of the normal curve, there's going to be more boys than girls, which just pulls down the average. In personality, when you get a little bit older, women are generally more anxious, more gregarious, more conscientious, more extroverted, and less assertive. Whereas males are higher in openness to experience. But these are all small to medium effects, no huge things. The largest effect size was in a variable called tender-mindedness, which is the extent to which an individual's judgments are determined by emotion. Sympathy is a big part of this. And there was an effect size of 1.07. That is enormous. You will almost never see effect sizes this big. Of all of the differences between males and females that people could come up and say, I think this might be one, this is the one you should say, yeah, this is a difference. This is an actual difference between males and females and is likely biologically based. In terms of emotion, There's small differences through adolescence in positive and negative emotions, with women being slightly higher in each of them. But the difference gets larger into middle adulthood. So basically, women feel stronger both positive and negative emotions than men. In aggression, this is one of the most well replicated findings that men are more aggressive than women. The effect size is about 0.55. And just as an aside, if a huge and really well replicated finding is that men are more aggressive than women and the effect size is 0.55, and that tender mindedness effect size was 1.07, that should tell you how huge that effect is. Now back to aggression. So differences in aggression start around age 2. Um, and it turns out, as we've said before, the most violent time period in life is around age 2. But these differences in relational aggression, not just physical aggression, but relational aggression that are thought to be huge, are actually modest. They're in the small range, so 0.1 to 0.2, not too huge. And then finally, sexuality. There are no large gender differences in sexuality. There are 4 moderate ones, at least by the study I'm looking at, this huge, really good study. And the 4 moderate effect size differences are in masturbation, pornography use, number of sexual partners, and attitudes towards casual sex. Now, a problem here is that this research is primarily self-report, right? We typically are not having cameras following people around and making sure that they're actually telling the truth about these things. But interestingly, one study took 3 different conditions and tried to see, did the condition that data were collected influence how people responded, how men responded. So there were 3 different conditions. One was where there was a questionnaire that was dropped off in a drop-off box anonymously. A second one is where they were hooked up to a polygraph test, a fake polygraph, but a polygraph nonetheless, a lie detector test. And the third one, they were in what's called an exposure threat scenario. They filled out a survey and handed it to an undergraduate research assistant. The difference was amazing in that men reported the most sexual partners when they handed it in the exposure threat condition, when they handed it to a research assistant, an actual undergrad. Then it went down to the anonymous drop-off, but the differences between men and women disappeared when they were hooked up to this fake polygraph. Meaning that it really does seem, at least this is some evidence, that it might largely be that men are overstating how many sexual partners they are having. So are there actual differences in these things? Maybe, but it's something to definitely be skeptical of. So what are the main things to take away from this lecture? Well, one, I think, is that gender is much more complicated than we think, that the strict dichotomy of male-female doesn't always work, even at a chromosomal level, and that the differences between men and women, anyway, are pretty small. There are very few large effect size differences between men and women. And some of these differences might have come about due to evolutionary reasons, and some of them might come about because of sexism, discrimination, and the like. But nonetheless, it's a really good conversation to have about where these are, what kind of society we want to live in, and how we see our society moving and where it should move on all of these issues.